It's my great honor to introduce briefly Professor Subhas Ranjan Chakraborty. I'm not going to read a CV, as Susan told you already. It's in your little booklet if you want it. But I can't resist saying that there are at least 3 generations of wisdom here, starting from Professor Chakraborty and going to the next, and then the next generation, who have been taught by him. And there's a great implicit presence of several generations who have also benefited from this connection. Now, I know he doesn't like being put on the spot like this, but he already mentioned it, so I'll mention it again, that this will be 34 years of conversations condensed to 34 minutes. And we shall try our best to try and be coherent. What sparked my interest in actually inviting Professor Chakraborty was a talk that he gave during the pandemic, which was called Teaching the French Revolution in Calcutta. And this connected, I thought, very well the question of the Enlightenment and universalism and its particular manifestations, not just in France, where notoriously universalism doesn't do quite as well as it's made out to be, but also in its travels in the colonies and its various manifestations. And this paper, which is now in print for those of you who read Bengali, because it was in Bengali, is available. But what I thought...
Just have a copy.
Those of you who read it, here's the copy.
Ben wanted me to show this.
Yes. And so, yeah, those of you who can read it, and I think Amber might actually if she looks at it. But I thought we'd start by giving him the opening word. I had a sort of set of simplifications which I will ask him to start with and get beyond, where I tried to summarize what I thought he was saying, which is that the question of the French Revolution isn't so much the triumph of reason and universalism that it becomes in retrospective accounts, but its promises of universalism, even when broken, provided a resource for those in various struggles from Haiti to Chandanagar. And I will give him the floor.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thanks to Susan and the Einstein Forum for having me here. It's been great. I hope I will not bore you over the next 34 minutes or so that I'll be talking with Ben. I just want to present very briefly what I want to say, basically, the outline, maybe in 15-20 minutes, and I would read part of it because then I'll be able to keep within time. Ben has said this is what I want to examine, what I thought of examining. That book that is here is a lecture in the memory of Professor Sushobhan Chandra Sarkar. He was a legendary teacher of history in Presidency College, Calcutta, which was a center of quote-unquote enlightenment in Bengal at least. And it is an institution which started as Hindu college in 1817, became Presidency College and a government institution in 1855. 2011, it became Presidency University. I and Ben belong to Presidency College. Here, Bipasha, Debojit and Devorshi, they belong to the Presidency University. So, both. College, they saw the transition. And so, we are here in a crowd almost. The point that I wish to make is that the question of universalism that subsumes any talk of French Revolution, at least when we were students, I started teaching BA in 1961, prehistoric times. And then we knew that Enlightenment, particularly the French philosophers, had a great role to play. It was more the philosophers than Enlightenment that was valorized at that time, particularly the French philosophers. But this subsumption is particularly probably identified or enshrined in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. But we know that while it declared that all men are equal, all men must have liberty, France itself did not introduce this, or the revolution after its success, did not introduce this universalism immediately, because voting right franchise was based on property rights, and it continued that for one abortive constitution of 1793 that the Jacobins tried to put through, there was universal male suffrage, but nothing for women. And women did not matter at all. They were not part of what the French call the pays légal, or the political nation. And even a triad revolutionary like Chomet would call Olympe de Gouges, one of the rare figures of the French Revolution among women, as a shameless and unnatural woman, because she had left the household and was participating in the revolutionary process in the clubs and other places. So, if this was the case in France, then what happened elsewhere? I just present very briefly three things. First, when it came to idea of when the revolutionary news came to India, what really happened? France had 5 major centers. In the second, I look at the revolution in Saint Domingue, led by Toussaint L'Ouverture. And finally, I take from Olivier Lecourt Grand Maison and his article, Loi et l'exception. I had the privilege of translating it into English for a Routledge volume. And there he says how law and its exception comes, the notion, and how there had to be exceptional laws for the colonies. French laws were not automatically applicable there. So these are three of these. Toussaint's story would probably take a little more time. The revolutionary news of the revolution came to Pondicherry, the most important of the French colonies on the southeastern coast of India, when a ship called Bienvenue reached Pondicherry in May 1790. February 1790, took about 7 months. Right? Now, it did create some enthusiasm in the colonies, but activities were confined mostly to the French residents there. Not the Indians were not very much involved in this, but you know what happened is that they started making making colonial assembly and representative assembly, following the Constituent Assembly, the constitutions which were adopted. But in this, the participation of the people were not there. This event was, what really happened, had been very meticulously recorded with a lot of details by one Marguerite Labernadi way back in 1930. Around 2020, a new edition was published, which had an introduction by Jacques Weber, a recent historian. Now, Jacques Weber has certain things to say about this. The colonial assemblies were there, but nothing happened. The news of the Republic came to the colonies, nothing happened. And the people were now becoming restive, and they just made a plea that they should be represented in the colonial assemblies. But this was not done. Some changes were effected, but these changes were in the administration of the Indian colonies in accordance with the directives of the French Revolutionary Administration. However, there were no signs of a complete restructuring of the the horizon, especially with regard to the rights of the local inhabitants of the colonies. Jacques Weber has written that some people in Paris had believed that France, regenerated by the Enlightenment, will be able in the near future to free the Indians from the oppression of the East India Company. But no instances or endeavors towards that the same were observed. In fact, Vipasha had mentioned about Tipu Sultan, Tree of Liberty and the Jacobin Club. Tipu was looking up to the French for support against the company. And that's support, the kind of support that he needed, never got. And therefore, there was no question of solid French support that French colonies, French government was not in a position to give anyway. Jacques Weber also says that many thought that Diderot was against colonialism, but according to Weber, he actually advocated for, quote, an emancipatory and humanist colonization which will restore France's influence and moral prestige in India, making them an equal adversary to England. On the other hand, a member of the Representative Assembly proposed that Indians in the French colonies should be included in the political processes, as the French slave was now a free man. His proposal was not accepted. Later, it was decided that when local issues were discussed, then some 4 members would be represented, would be invited to be present there. But what is more interesting is that in September 1790, the Abbé Grégoire gave an impassioned speech on the rights of the Indians in the French National Assembly. Nevertheless, local inhabitants were completely excluded from the assembly, as we have noted earlier. The inhabitants decided to go against the decisions of March 1791, not to include them. But when they decided to take a march making their demands clear, the local administration categorized this as a revolt, and it was not countenanced. What is more important, in December 1792, Commissioner Lescalier, who had just arrived from France, announced that France would always respect the religion and manners of Indians, and they would ensure that Indians would always be able to lead their lives in peace under the protection of the French flag and under the benevolent laws of the nation, unquote. However, according to him, again, quote, it had taken many centuries for the principle of equality to germinate in France. In the context, it would not be possible to grant this right to the Indians. Thus, it seemed that the revolutionary principles of equality, liberty, and fraternity would appear to have stopped short of the borders of the colonies. Now, what Lescalier said, we will see how it is repeated from, I'll give you some instances from 1842 to 2005 almost, how it is repeated with regard to the necessity for exceptionality of law in the colonies. Now I go on to the second part, Toussaint L'Ouverture and the revolution of Saint Domingue. It's well known, Toussaint L'Ouverture's story was first really elaborated by C.L.R. James in the Black Jacobins. Later, Aimé Césaire, I think a few years later, also wrote on Toussaint L'Ouverture. Very recently, Sudhir Hazari Singh has written a very massive volume of 800 pages called Toussaint L'Ouverture, An Epic Life. It indeed is an epic life. And I argue, following, of course, these historians, this is a disclaimer I should have given at the beginning. I've not researched on this. I'm using secondary sources and a very long experience of reading history with, some of them are here for how many years? I mean, I been teaching for more than 50 years now. But I've taught this in Presidency College for more than a quarter century, French Revolution included, and part of other European histories. So Toussaint, just briefly his life, His parents were brought as slaves from Africa. He was born probably in 1740. He became free man in 1775 at the age of 35. He then married, had 2 sons, and that's how it was going. The universal principle of, let me read a little bit. The universal principle of French Revolution must have reached the shores of Saint Domingue as well. The opponents of slavery were present in France. A society against the slavery named Société des Amis des Noirs was founded in 1788. Abbé Grégoire, Condorcet, Mirabeau, Brissot, etc. were its members. They often spoke of removing disabilities on the slavery, but they think nothing had really happened. Now, some philosophers recently have shown how Enlightenment, or other, shall we call the philosophers generally, someone mentioned about the Locke's slavery a little earlier in a question. I'm not going into that. But Sala Molins, a Spanish philosopher, has noted that Rousseau nowhere mentions le Code Noir. Code Noir was a code or law that Louis XIV had introduced in 1685, I think. And it was a law about the slaves in France and the French colonies. Rousseau never mentioned it, and she believes that it's strange that Rousseau was ignorant of this. On the other hand, Sala Molins has mentioned another Spanish priest called Bartolomé de las Casas, who protested against the slavery of indigenous Americans, if not Africans, in the 16th century, and in her opinion was way more progressive than the secular philosophers 2 centuries later. It is significant that 10% of the members of the French Constituent Assembly had invested in the slave-based plantation system in Saint Domingue. The political and social inclination of such members can be easily imagined. The Haitian Revolution was, in a way, crucible, the trial by fire of the ideals of the French Enlightenment. This is why Suzanne Bach-Morse has referred to the revolution of Saint Domingue or Haiti as a defining moment in world history. Recently, over the last 30, 40 years, a lot of new histories have been written with this, relating to this period. I would mention some of them. Susan Bach-Morse, I've mentioned that name. Joan Diane, Sybil Fisher, Peter Linebaugh and Marcus Rediker, Robin Blackburn, Paul Gilroy, etc. There are many more. Sudhir Hazari Singh, I've just mentioned. The colony of Saint Domingue was very, very crucial and lucrative to France. It was in 1789 the colony of Saint Domingue supplied 2/3 of the French overseas trade. At the same time, it housed the largest European slave market. The colony was France's crowning glory and the envy of European imperialist powers. The entire economy was based on the labor of more than 500,000 slaves. In 1767, Saint Domingue produced 3,000 tons of sugar. In France, 20% of the bourgeoisie were dependent on slave-related commercial activity. Some historians have not mentioned, while talking about plantation, about economy and the domination of certain European nations in trade in the 16th and the 17th century. Simon Schama, for example, who had written a revisionist account of the French Revolution in the book called Citizens. He has written a book called Embarrassment of Riches, where he never mentions about the lucrative Dutch slave trade, which was really almost at the root of Dutch commercial significance. So there was slavery. Toussaint L'Ouverture became a leader. He was actually secretary of the leader of Biassou. They decided, after the revolution, they decided that it is time for them to also make their revolution and free themselves. In August, 2 years after the revolution, In August 1791, the slaves of Saint Domingue rose in revolt. C.L.R. James, as I've already noted, gives us a rudimentary understanding of how and why this was done. The idea originally, as C.L.R. James had noted it, was to get together, armed, organize, attack the plantations, kill some whites, and then start the revolution. But it did not carry on. The governor found that something racy was in the air and was trying to prepare for that. What they did was, in the night of 22nd August, amidst storm and rain, many leaders of the revolt gathered in the forest of Bois Caiman. The bookman, a priest, addressed the gathering, asking them to pray in accordance with the voodoo rituals, and gave them a final directive in Creole. Quote, "The God who created the sun that gives us light sees all that the white man does. The God of the white man inspires him with crime, but our God calls upon us to do good works. He will direct our arms and aid us." And he finally asserted, quote, "Throw away the image of God of the whites who thirst for our tears, and listen to the voice of liberty which speaks in the heart of all of us." This is something to be noted, that the voodoo ritual was there, but even this priest is talking of liberty. As Toussaint L'Ouverture had said, that liberty, freedom is a right given by nature. He was talking of natural rights. He also says, education will spread through our regenerated land, which was once under enslavement, odious as it was, as unacceptable. Man will now be elevated on the wings of liberty. So, they assimilated, they borrowed the idea, they were inspired by the idea of liberty, and they were now seeking to achieve that liberty, and we know what happened after that. What is interesting is that some historians have now been saying that the ritual beginning of the revolt was a symbolic break between European traditions and the newly established tradition of the colonies. The resurgence of African traditions, religion and rituals also point towards that break. At the same time, the enshrining of the invocation of freedom in minds is also significant as the influence of the contemporary French Revolution. Thus, the success of the slave revolt also underlines the need to write a new political history. The success of the rebels, it was not easy. The rebellion continued for 12 years. They fought the French forces, Spanish forces, and defeated an English force of 60,000, because Saint Domingue had two parts, French and Spanish colony, and there were English colonies nearby. It was a great fight. After that, Napoleon came to France, and he sent his brother-in-law Leclerc, the husband of his sister Pauline, and a general, to take care of the rebels. He did not succeed. And what is interesting, he took Toussaint as a captive. And Toussaint was taken to France, where in 1803 he died. When he was taken to the ship, he told the captain of the ship, "In taking me, you have cut the tree of liberty at the trunk only. It will regenerate because the roots are still there, and they are deep and many." This is exactly what happened. Because after Toussaint was gone, let me tell you something very interesting, little story about the fighting of Leclerc's army and the French army. The rebel army. The French army was quite confused who they were fighting. Are they fighting friends or enemies? Because the red and blue flag of the rebels also had liberty and death imprinted on that, and they were all singing Marseillaise. And later, a group of Polish soldiers in Leclerc's brigade, you all know that Napoleon's brigades were all collected from all over Europe because of the revolution on horseback meant collecting men for war as well. And they refused the order to shoot about 500 or 600 rebel army because they were totally confused about this. They were also singing Marseillaise. And Dessalines gave shelter to all of them. Dessalines took charge after Toussaint was gone, and by 1803, next year, the same year, he declared a new republic. Its name was Haiti. He gave the Polish soldiers shelter by calling them the Negroes of Europe. Hereby I'm raising a question about the category of Europe and non-Europe. Was Europe a category? Was the Polish soldiers, Poland, a part of Europe? Was the Balkans part of Europe? The question of margins are everywhere, Europe not excluded. And the revolt of Saint Domingue, of Toussaint L'Ouverture and others, made that very clear, indeed. One historian, David Patrick Gegas, believes that Leclerc's army's attempt to crush the rebel army was something like a genocide. Now, what was the link between the revolt or revolution and the French Revolution or the idols born of it? I've seen that already to some extent. Now, Thomas Jefferson was talked about by Friedrich earlier. Thomas Jefferson, there isn't much impact of this revolt on America. Only response was Thomas Jefferson, who had called Toussaint L'Ouverture and his comrades cannibals of the terrible republic. On the other hand, in France, the debate regarding the slavery had become, in the end, inextricably woven into this external politics and into the narratives in relation with the colonies. At the same time, it is important to note that the Black Jacobins of Saint Domingue, outdoing France, realized the Enlightenment ideal of human liberty and proved that the French Revolution was not a European phenomenon, its significance was universal. If we become accustomed to different narratives, ones that place the colonial events on the margins of European history, we have been terribly misled. Events in Saint Domingue were central to contemporary attempt to make sense out of the reality of the French Revolution and its aftermath. We need to be aware of the facts from this perspective. Abbé Grégoire continues to be a very consistent figure. He supported Toussaint L'Ouverture and also Jacques Quinat of Martinique. He wrote about them. He apparently wrote about literature of the Negroes because he was trying to avoid the censorship of Napoleon. And Grégoire refused to accept the bishopship, the position of bishop in Haiti. Haiti was then a kingdom already, because they had paid compensation to the planters for official recognition of the French. He was against this. I very briefly, I am sorry, I'm probably overshooting my time. 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Toussaint L'Ouverture's universalism Saint Domingue, was probably a little more intense than this. We can continue this in the Constitution, in the conversation. I just want to mention one thing. The Constitution that L'Ouverture had introduced in 1801, it declared, quote, "Slaves may not exist in this territory. Servitude is forever abolished. Here all men are born, live and die, free and French. All men, whatever their color, are here admissible to all employments, unquote. This is a categorical statement which we did not find in the French constitutions. Toussaint hailed the individuality of the revolution of Saint Domingue, and it was somewhat more democratic in the context of the time. Let me, I need to say a little more on Toussaint. We will in the course of the conversation. And I just can't resist this to quote the sonnet, part of the sonnet that Wordsworth had written on Toussaint. This came out in the Morning Post on 2nd February 1803. I'm reading just 5-6 lines. Though fallen thyself, never to rise again, leave and take comfort. Thou hast left behind powers that will work for thee, air, earth, skies. There is not a breathing of the common wind that will forget thee. Thou hast great allies. Thy friends are exaltations, agonies, and love, and man's unconquerable mind. I come to the last section, law and its exception in the colonies. I just give you a few quotations and I end. 1842, Beaumont, in a report on Algeria, advised the making of different laws for the colony. He said there are, I'm quoting him, quote, there are in Africa two societies, one distinct for the other. One, for each there is a regime and a set of law. Many others, unquote, many others quoted Tocqueville, particularly during the Third Republic. Tocqueville said, he wrote a book on Algeria in which, I'm quoting him, quote, nothing absolutely prevents, when Europeans are concerned, to treat as if they are alone the rules that we are making for themselves, for them, necessarily being applied to them, unquote. Again, in the Chamber of Deputies in 1847, he said, quote, it is necessary to create for Africa a machinery of government more simple in its mechanism and quick in its application than the one which works for France, unquote. The second was quoted by Dupont, who was associated with the Algerian government in 1901. The Article 109 of the Constitution of Second Republic declared Algeria and the colonies to be French areas, but added particular laws will be made in accordance with the special laws under the present Constitution. French Harmon, a French diplomat, in a book in 1910, writes, quote, as for the rights of man, they sound like the artificial ideas dear to the evangelists of the French Revolution, unquote. Another small quotation, quote, let us not deceive ourselves, let us not cheat. For what should we disguise truth? Colonialism from the beginning is not an act of civilization. It is an act of force. Colonialism is from the beginning a project of interested persons. It is unilateral and egoistical, accomplished by the strong over the weak, unquote. You must be thinking these are the statements of a virulent critic of colonialism. No, it is Sarraut, who was the Minister of French Colonies, Department of Colonies, and he was simply inaugurating a school, colonial school, in 1923. Two more quotations. Quote, the indigenous are not comparable with the French. They have neither their moral quality nor their level of education, nor their religion, nor their civilization. The mistake is generous and pretty French. It was made by those who drafted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, instead of simply drafting the Declaration of the Rights of the French citizens. Paul Azan, he was a French general and wrote a book on Algeria. The next one is very interesting. It could be ironical. Quote, the indigenous have demesne, laws and a fatherland, which is not ours. We do not make their happiness, neither according to the French Revolution, which is our revolution, nor according to the Code Napoleon, which is our code, unquote. This is Félix Éboué. He was the first colored governor of Equatorial Africa. And he also wrote a book later on l'Afrique politique indigène, the l'Afrique Equatorial Africa, française. And he proposed here that honoring what should be done, honoring the traditions of Africa, supporting the traditional leaders, development of the existing social infrastructure, and improving work environment. I'm inclined to believe that there was irony in what he said. And finally, the last evidence is from 2005. The French Parliament passed an act, Article 4 of Law Number 2005 by 158, which declared that, quote, French overseas presence, especially in Africa, was entirely positive, unquote. Comments are unnecessary. I just want to say one point last, is that we have been hearing about colonies and enlightenment. Enlightenment presumably quickening the pace of colonization. But colonies precede, colonies, we miss one point in this narrative, that of capital. Colonies were, to begin with, colonies were propelled by trade. And they were not colonies, but those who came as traders made themselves the rulers. As Rabindranath Tagore, our poet, has said once that the merchant's standard became the scepter of the ruler at the end of the night.
So there's a lot to start from, but one point I wanted to follow through was that the rule of exception was not something that was claimed by the colonized. It was the claim made by the colonizer upon the colonized. And it's curious that that role is now reversed, where so many people are claiming that it is the exception that should operate. Right? There's this famous quote by Frantz Fanon, where he actually relates it in the first instance to the white jazz expert's objection to the new forms of bebop. But he says, it is the colonizer who becomes the inventor of the native style. And you could see here that where an Enlightenment claim can be used as an act of resistance, the claim of being properly indigenous is usually used to keep the native in his place. And yet, today that is considered the resource rather than the claim to the universal applicability of the universal principles of a revolution. That's one point I thought I would pick up. The other is the constant distinction between the citizen at home and the subject abroad, or the only conditional acceptance of the subject. This is a long-standing question. How did this get reversed? Or do we have a question? By the way, if anybody wants to intervene at any point in this argument, put your hand up, I'll bring you in. How do we explain that what was once a claim to be included as an anti-colonial act becomes a claim to be excluded, which is still claiming to be an anti-colonial act?
This is a very difficult question. Yes, sorry.
So the mic
Bring it.
This is a very difficult question. I'm not sure I understood the question. Can you tell me again?
So my point was that when you claim that the universal applies in the colony, that if we have established equality, you cannot deny us our right to equality, then later on, today, you have a kind of post-colonial act of insisting that we are different and we claim our right to difference. We do not wish to be included. Now, there's a very different political context to this. But can you think of any instance where an act of resistance excludes oneself from the universal?
Difficult to say. Probably yes and no. Because, if you look at Saint Domingue, I would like to be confined to the major, my mind is a storytelling exercise. He says something.
No, just continue.
Yeah. Storytelling exercise. That, there was exceptionalism that they were claiming. They were claiming, and they claimed that they got that. Now, a post-colonial situation that you are referring to is a different context altogether. And it is difficult to judge that in the context that I am trying to narrate or talk about. So I really don't have an answer to that.
Yeah, go on.
If you get over the sense that the universal is one, or that what is universal is clear, then the question stops to be a question. Because one way to think of the universal is on the personal level, that all people are equal on the personal level. There is no nationalism. But there is another way to universalize, to think the universal, is that there is equality between nations. Then the universal is to create nation-states that have borders. Now, borders is by definition exclusion. So universalism can lead at one point to eliminating the borders, at other point to creating borders.
Absolutely.
So if you get over the idea that universal is something discovered and replace it with the idea that the universal is something that you turn a particular idea when and being universalized, the question stops to be a question.
Yes, absolutely. Point is, the revolutions begin with a message of being universal and could go to other places. France itself did try and spread the message. The point is that in the process, you don't have the universalist principles occurring, and there is a nationalization of the narrative of universalism. The French Revolution became a nationalized revolution within a century. Professor François Furet talked of terminer la révolution. That came around 1877, when finally MacMahon tried through his coup d'etat and a new constitution was made. And the French revolutionary government finally became republic. The revolution could only produce a republic. That is a kind of hope that was finalized then. And it is then that it became nationalized. You don't have 14 July as a national day till 1889.
Can I add one more dimension to that, though, which I think is interesting? Because the French Revolution itself becomes the prototype of all revolutions. In some ways, you expect the trajectory of the French Revolution to be a model for thinking about other revolutions. This is obviously most explicit in the way Trotsky writes, where he actually refers to phases of the French Revolution in the next revolutionary action. This is, in a way, a kind of universalizability. But it's also something that would now be very critically viewed. And is this because what was meant as analogy has now acquired an anti-ironic and rigid tone?
Well, I think what I wanted to present was French Revolution was a very significant one on the world historical scale. And what is this message? What is this iconic revolution about? It's about implementing certain principles, and French Revolution overthrew absolute monarchy, went to constitutional monarchy, then a moderate republic, then what Jonathan Israel says, authoritarian populism. Some would call the more radical republic, the Jacobin Republic of Bourgeoisie. Now, from here we have to judge what we are judging. I'm trying to look at the process of the revolution, and ultimately, when Napoleon came, the revolution was gone. There are repeated revolutions in France, right through the 19th century, finally culminating in the Republic, Third Republic, which became permanent. And it is in the process that the revolution ceased to be a universal beacon, and it became nationalized and to some extent racialized. As you can see in the narrative of exceptionalism, the colonies being others, we being others. The point you made about nationalism, nations, universalism creating nations, and nations being nations, they're not part of the universal system. I mean, we were talking of whether it is universalism is something that is given, that is an assumption, we took it as an assumption that can be challenged. It is never universal. It was not to begin with universal in France, the way the principles or ideas of revolution or the Enlightenment or the philosophers were implemented. But you see, there were new ideas as well. Someone mentioned, Professor Ajay mentioned Saint-Just. The Saint-Just during the terror, what is known as terror, but it was also something else. He talked of happiness being a new idea. And he later said, the revolution est glacée. Revolution has grown cold. Because even Robespierre and the Jacobins were afraid of popular initiative. They let it go up to a point, then try to restrain them. Therefore, when on the 9th Thermidor, Robespierre was arrested and put to guillotine, people had come, all the people had come, but they couldn't do anything else. But we forget that it is during this period that you had something called the law of the maximum and the law of the minimum, which is against what we have been talking about, the plantation economy. The bourgeoisie they did not want a minimum of wages and maximum of price. But it was done for some time at least. There was a grand livre de bienfaisance. Bourgeois had talked about this. Alan Forrest in his Poverty, Poor in the French Revolution talked about it. Grand livre de bienfaisance is a welfare book, register, where the poor, the indigent, those who had gone to the war, widowed people, it was acknowledged that the state has a responsibility to protect them. Now this is a universal point. It was emulated later. We know that after the Second World War, Keynes gets the entire benefit, credit for that. But there was a precedence. They tried it. They failed. They failed. But the attempt is significant, As someone said that the beautiful butterflies that Robespierre had conceived lay strewn like so many butterflies, so many glass toy butterflies of dream. But the dream is also important. I mean, in this universalism that we are suggesting, is that the dreams were created. Toussaint had that dream. Toussaint implemented that. Haiti became a republic. Then it became a monarchy. Why do revolutions go astray is a question that we can ask. I cannot give the answer. But I'm trying to understand this. Sorry.
Thank you, Professor Chakraborty. I have a quick question, but before that, I've been thinking of two images while you were speaking. One is from a play by George Bernard Shaw called Arms and the Man. And it talks about the chocolate cream soldier who is walking all over Europe fighting in wars for countries that pay him more. And the other is an image of France sending an all-black regiment to the Saarland. I think E.H. Carr talks about this in Europe between the wars. So France's one way of getting revenge for 1848, if you will, put very crudely, is to send a black regiment to the Saarland after the First World War. And these two images, I think, are striking about some of the contradictions that your talk allows us to consider. But my question is a little more specific, which is that I read what you're saying as not just an elucidation of the French Revolution in its times, but also of the French Revolution as a kind of national memory debate. What are the afterlives of the French Revolution? Which is why you kept going back to the historiography of the French Revolution. And here I am curious about another dream that also doesn't succeed, but that is a dream, and where there is some degree of official colonial participation, the emphasis being official, which is the League of Nations. When in the League of Nations, when India becomes the only country that is a colony, but that has an independent seat on the League, have you ever, and I'm purely curious, and maybe this doesn't exist, and that's why nobody has written about it, but have you ever seen any mention at this point of time, either from Indian delegates or just from any delegate or observers to the League, of the French Revolution at this moment?
At which moment?
During the League of Nations, either before or
I
after?
wouldn't know really.
No,
I haven't
okay.
done the working of the League in such great details. But the point is, the national memory is what it became in France. By 1889, in 1989, during the bicentenary Nouvelle Observateur, a newspaper, it said that in 1889, the French Revolution was still politics, part of politics. Now, it is only part of history. Now, the history of the revolution is still very rich and varied. I'm not doing just historiography, I'm doing historiography in the context of the time. My accent was on Toussaint L'Ouverture. He is bringing a new kind of universalism because his constitution of 1891 was different from any other constitution. They are all talking of liberty. Now, this must have come from France, must have come from the French Revolution. This is the important. He glorifies the Republic. His republicanism, historians have noticed, is a little different. I could read a couple of paragraphs if time permits later. But my point is to see this, and it inspired others. It led to a whole, what Paul Gilroy calls the Black Atlantic. There were many others there. And there was an internationalist context to this, and some kind of liaison, some kind of connections. One historian has mentioned that in 1741, there was a revolt in the New York port, mutiny kind of. It was part by the Marrons, the runaway slaves, and the European immigrants, the poorer ones, who found it difficult to come in. But they understood what they wanted to do. It's a multi-ethnic group, and they were trying to go against a power that be and do something. Now, this is something that long before 1792, but this has been happening for some time. Toussaint definitely inspired others. You talked about Ireland, black soldiers going there. In 1790s, an Irish Republican talked about, not in 1790, yes, Toussaint L'Ouverture. He writes about him. A little later, another, John Swinney, who is a United Irishman, he names one of his sons as Toussaint. And they say that we are equals, black and white. We are created by the same creator.
I'll take one from Susan, and I have one last comment. Or anybody else who's like?
I can pass if somebody else wants.
No, go on.
But
Oh,
Aziz
is
has.
Well, this is extremely. Sorry, this is extremely.
Yes,
Wouldn't
please.
you? Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, this is truly extremely suggestive, and there are quite a number of things that might be taken further, might be a little bit discussed. So, but instead of asking a specific question, may I just make a comment? And then we can take it from there. Namely, there has been mention of the nationalization of the revolution, right? But of course, this is beyond the tricolor and singing the Marseillaise and the figure of Marianne and all of that, which persists in a variety of locations. It is actually not only nationalization; it's also the etatization of the institutions arising from the revolution. Arising from the revolution to such an extent that, for instance, and this is something I owe to this wonderful book for Peasants into Frenchmen, whereby the state administration actually not only treated the Algerians and the Moroccans as material for civilization, but treated much of Eastern France in exactly the same way and using the same language. That these people of the Haute-Savoie are really, it's like people from the Christmas Islands, yeah? or from Algeria. And they need to be actually then inducted into the sorts of institutions and states of mind which the revolution had spawned and that had spread all around the world using Napoleonic armies. Hence, the tricolor, which becomes almost universal, particular types of law which become almost universal, be it in Spain or in Italy, in Poland, in the Middle East, and then through Simón Bolívar in Latin America. So there is this kind of universalizing and etatized form of practicing ideas and institutions arising out of the revolution. Do you think this makes sense?
It does, because the state itself might be a part that started there and became universalized. The state as we know it today, when does this state come?
Indeed.
So, excellent. Thank you so much for your
Susan.
comment.
Just a very short remark. Mostly, as I usually do with historians, I was letting myself be informed about things that I don't know about. But you did make one remark, and I think you were quoting somebody, but you seem to be quoting approvingly that Bartolomeo de las Casas was more radical or progressive.
I'm not saying Salamon said this.
Okay, you don't think
I
that?
didn't say it. No.
Okay, because I actually think there's a huge difference between de las Casas and, say, Voltaire or Diderot. De las Casas talks about cruelty towards the indigenous Americans, but then tries, suggests importing Africans. Yeah. I think late in his life, apparently, he decided that slavery was cruel for everybody. Yes. But what I think is interesting is the Enlightenment, the philosopher says it's not just the cruelty, it's the inherent indignity of one person's claiming to own someone else. Okay, so we're on the same page about that.
Dehumanizing.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a major problem. I mean, we have to accept this. And this is, its first successful slave revolt is that of Toussaint L'Ouverture. And of that we must say that it came in the context of time. It is very significant. And it has other, I mean, I had a lot more material, but maybe we'll discuss it. Sorry.
So, yeah. So we have, with just 2 minutes over, if anybody had a question.
May I just add
yeah, go on.
one element?
Go on.
It's interesting when you posed the question of what is Europe, and you mentioned the Poles as the Negroes of
Yes, Dessalines said that.
Yes, as the Negroes of Europe. Of course, the Poles at that time were trying to impress upon other colonial powers that they also ought to be given some kind of colony somewhere in Africa specifically, without much success. But the interesting thing there is that the pecking order within Europe is evident. There are parts of Europe that then become Europe at particular points in time. Let us take the parts of Europe that were part of the Soviet bloc. They were called, of course, at that time, Eastern Europe. Immediately when the EU starts working on them, then it becomes Central Europe. You see, it's as if really the East almost disappears. The East almost disappears, with all that the East, evokes, comes to evoke in one's mind. And this, this is almost like a living laboratory of the making of a continent. The past 20, 30 years. It's fascinating to watch, and fascinating to watch the way in which language on this actually then changes and is made, right? As
the Balkans and the Eastern question before that.
Yes, indeed.
The historians have, engaged in this. It was really a line from North to South Europe that divides Europe, East and West to an extent. The same line through which the barbarians came, probably plague also came. So you have you have all the things coming from the east, and those who are in the borderlands, they are more affected by them.
So I'll close it there for now because we have one more speaker. No, my question raises an entirely new set of things because it was going to be about the worship of reason and how that treats reason as a completely different thing. But that's a very big thing to add now.
Yes, absolutely.
So maybe we'll leave that for a later stage. Yes, for the later
For
stage.
further conversation.
But thank you for that, and we'll close this paper and go to the next.
Thank you so much.